Review by Alan Lima, editor of Revolution Arena. If you are a lover of martial arts movies with unbridled action, Sifu is certainly the game for you. The game brings extremely familiar and well-known concepts, but its execution is original and full of personality, with interesting ideas that bring its own identity to the game. These ideas bring their share of problems, but these are not enough to take the shine out of the game, which promises to hold the player and make him feel like a true kung fu master. While playing Sifu, the feeling I had is that I was really mastering the art of kung fu and acting exactly as I believe a real master would act in the same situation imposed in the game, with total concentration, watching and reading the movements of the enemies, looking for the right moment to attack using the right blows, in a combination of ferocity and intelligence. This feeling of immersion is due to several factors that involve, from the gameplay and game mechanics, to the fidelity it brings, the result of an accurate motion capture that makes you feel like you are in a John Wick movie, or even in large classics from names like Jackie Chan, Jet Li, and Bruce Lee. Entering a disco and kicking ass at everyone present while the music continues to play almost rhythmically with its punches and knocking them down one by one, watching the environment slowly turn into chaos, was certainly one of the best experiences I've ever had in a type game. Fighting in Sifu is extremely satisfying thanks to a round gameplay and a set of animations that are a visual delight, being possible to feel the weight of each blow. The scenarios favor the fight, allowing you to use them to your advantage, whether throwing enemies against something, throwing objects across the scenario, or even jumping over tables and obstacles to escape blows, in the best Jackie Chan style. The variety of enemies and fighting styles to be faced is great, and the numerical disadvantage is constant, making the use of all available resources in your favor practically a must. At various times the fights become chaos without losing any of the style, and although the camera gets in the way at different times, the feeling is of being playing a movie with all the interactive aspect that a video game brings. Sifu is definitely not a button crusher game, in which you can advance by pressing the attack button repeatedly, in a repeating pattern. At first, the basics that we've seen in several games are there. You advance through the scenarios, and to fight it has a button for weak blows and one for strong blows, a button for the player to take a longer stride that would normally work as a dodge, and also a block button, but it doesn't take long for the various layers that give body to the gameplay to appear. To effectively dodge enemy blows, you need to hold the block button and direct the analog stick down or up at the right time of the blow, down if it's a high attack and up if it's a low attack. Simply hold down. L1 blocks at the cost of a slash called structure, that when it reaches its limit, it leaves you vulnerable to attacks, and finally we have parry, which works when we press L1 at the exact moment of the blow, opening a window to attack. Enemies have basically the same resources, and when we break their structure we open up the possibility of finishing them. It is also possible to use combos and moves with specific combinations of buttons, as well as a focus bar, which allows you to perform special moves, which is filled when parrying or successfully dodging. Being that when we break their structure, we open the possibility of finishing them. It is also possible to use combos and moves with specific combinations of buttons, as well as a focus bar, which allows you to perform special moves, which is filled when parrying or successfully dodging. Being that when we break their structure, we open the possibility of finishing them. It is also possible to use combos and moves with specific combinations of buttons, as well as a focus bar, which allows you to perform special moves, which is filled when parrying or successfully dodging. The learning curve in Sifu is long and arduous, not because it is difficult to memorize the commands, but because knowing how to use them with precision requires reflexes and, above all, a knowledge of how each opponent fights. The game encourages and works for the player to master the resources it offers and to be perfect, or almost, in its execution, and that's exactly where the feeling of becoming a kung fu master comes from. Sifu is extremely punitive with errors, and that's what the game builds on its main mechanic, getting old with each death. Die once and the character will age 1 year, add one more death and he will age 2 years, and so on. The older you are, the more damage your attacks will do, but your resistance to enemy attacks will also decrease. If you reach 72 and die, it's game over. It is with this principle that Sifu changes everything, for better or for worse. The aging mechanic is creative and gives depth to a game that has an extremely simple premise, and Sloclap makes a point of highlighting it by making almost everything revolve around it, starting with the game's difficulty. Sifu is an extremely difficult game, the kind of difficulty that will make the player feel rewarded when he succeeds, but that will also make him feel tired at times. That's because repetition is the watchword here, and this originates precisely in this aging mechanic. Even while the player is still young, his damage resistance is mediocre and few hits, even from the most common enemies, can get you killed quickly, and that's on purpose. Let's say you die a few times in the first stage of the game, and you end it at age 35. You move on to the second stage, which presents a much higher level of difficulty, and at the cost of a few more deaths you finish it with 55. At this point, you realize that there are still 3 stages left and only 17 years of life left until the definitive game over, so you will almost necessarily have to repeat the past stages to get a better performance in terms of age. The central point of the game's difficulty is precisely this, the search for near perfection by making as little mistakes as possible and thus trying to stay as young as possible. The game encourages this by adding shortcuts that are normally unlocked at the end of the level by picking up a key or access card that will give access to it, so the second attempt will be shorter and to the point, and you will always start the next level with the minor age who finished the previous one, without losing their progress. But that's not all. The game also has skill trees that can be unlocked with experience and scores. The problem is that unlocking them permanently will inevitably require you to repeat the stages to accumulate XP. If, on the one hand, this difficulty arising from the search for perfectionism is pleasant and contributes to the player feeling like a kung fu master, giving a long life to a game that otherwise could be very short, on the other hand, the repetition that is necessary to overcome it can be extremely tiring. The shortcuts and enjoyable gameplay aren't enough to sustain this for long, and the feeling of tiredness, I'd say, is almost inevitable unless you master the game quickly. Furthermore, although the difficulty is rewarding, it seems to me to be fickle, without following a gradual evolution. I particularly found the second phase much more difficult than the third, and the fourth much more difficult than the last, just to name a few examples. The boss fights are the test of fire in terms of difficulty. In Sifu you will follow the story of a young kung fu student on a revenge trail, hunting the murderers of his family. The premise is extremely cliché, but the story is full of elements that could undoubtedly give a certain depth. Unfortunately, Sloclap misses the opportunity by not taking advantage of any of them. Of course, the narrative isn't exactly the focus in games like this, but it's still sad to see before your eyes several opportunities to stick to the plot and simply not succeed because it's such a poorly worked aspect. So let's get back to the key point of the game, the aging mechanic. The main character, whose name is never mentioned in the game, has a magical artifact that brings him back to life whenever he dies, at the cost, of course, of rapid aging. Spoilers aside, this artifact is a key plot piece, but it's so poorly worked out and so little mentioned that you don't even care about it beyond the gameplay mechanics. The origins of the artifact and the intertwining that it could generate with the theme of revenge and its consequences are so wide open that the feeling of disappointment is inevitable when seeing that everything is underused. You have a detective board, in which items and small clues are stored that, when interconnected, gradually reveal the motivations and origins of the facts, but it is all so shallow that you hardly feel like looking for such items. In the review I mentioned that it is possible to feel the weight of each blow thrown, and part of this is due to Sifu's sound design. The game never skimps on the sound impact that the beating causes, making the fights even more exciting. The soundtrack is also a spectacle on its own. Produced by Howie Lee, a relatively unknown Chinese musician, the soundtrack perfectly encapsulates Sifu's mood of constant action, but without completely abandoning classical Chinese instrumentability. It is possible to perceive electronic beats and Chinese percussion in more hectic moments, and the lull of classical Chinese instruments such as the guzheng in moments of reflection or more tense and mysterious. From beginning to end, Sifu's soundtrack matches its theme perfectly and is another hit by Sloclap. The art direction of Sifu is a spectacle on its own. As it's not a AAA game, one shouldn't expect raw power in its graphics, but Sloclap has chosen a no less eye-catching path. With a look using the cell shading technique, Sifu exudes style and impeccable artistic beauty, which goes far beyond the mere visual aspect. The ambience choices, the typical Chinese decorations, and the mix between the modern urban and the classic Chinese look demonstrate Sloclap's care and enormous respect for Chinese culture. Even if we are not familiar with it, playing Sifu will certainly make you feel a little closer to what we grew up seeing in martial arts movies. The modeling of the characters is not far behind, everything being very creative and, again, full of style. Sifu means master in Cantonese, one of the languages spoken in China, and the title couldn't be more appropriate, as the game makes you feel like one. If the player overcomes the challenges and the fatigue that repetition can bring, he will be rewarded with what is, for me, a game that is on the right track for a definitive beat 'em up. Sifu is a must for any lover of the genre and one of the most pleasant surprises of recent times in the gaming market. Rating: Graphics, 9. Fun, 8. Gameplay, 10. Sound, 10. Final note, 9.25.